Hi folks, thanks for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to be talking all about pressure cookers and sterilization for DIY mushroom cultivation. First, I'll talk about the general concepts and then compare the pros and cons of different types of pressure cookers. In part 2, I'll talk about safety tips and use procedures. In part 3, I'll go over some ways that you can bulk up and that you can achieve the same results without a pressure cooker, so make sure to stick around.
Never give up.
One of the obvious first questions when we dive into a whole conversation around sterilization is, why the hell do we go through all this trouble? After all, these organisms are thriving where they exist in nature. Why can't we just let them grow? At the heart of the matter, that's really the whole point of mushroom cultivation. We want to create the ideal environment for our organisms to flourish and then just let them be and do their thing. The thing is, life is everywhere, and many of the mushroom-producing species that we're interested in growing grow relatively slowly, so we need to help them have competitive advantage over other more opportunistic organisms like mold or single-celled organisms like yeast and bacteria. As we walk along the path of our mushroom cultivation journey, there's a big fork in the road and we have to decide, are we going to focus on supporting and encouraging the life that's already present and adapted to the environment where we are? Or are we going to focus on producing specific results with specific organisms that we're interested in for a specific purpose? Because if we're going to go with the latter, we're going to have to take some extra steps to maintain total control over those conditions. Otherwise, all those other things that are more well adapted to this environment are going to have a much better competitive advantage. At the end of the day, this is really a matter of weighing how much time and energy we're putting into different parts of the process and how likely we are to achieve our desired result. If we're going to be purchasing sterile inoculum or going through the trouble of making it ourselves, it takes a lot of time and work and care. And it's really disappointing when one small mistake later on in the process spoils everything that came before. So, in general, we want to mitigate our risk by taking those extra steps to be completely sterile. However, it's also worth noting that sterility is not entirely necessary, and in many cases is way more trouble than it's worth. What we need to keep in mind is that life inhabits nearly every nook and cranny of this beautiful planet, and so if we create the ideal environment for a fungus to grow, we're probably going to run into some of its cousins, and some of those might not be our friends. When you really get down to the nitty-gritty, sterilization is actually a matter of degrees. If all we want to do is make our drinking water safe, boiling it is just fine. However, if we're going to be performing open heart surgery, we need to be absolutely certain that there's nothing that could compromise the sterility of our environment. So, it's important to understand that depending on what it is that we're trying to sterilize and how we intend to use it, different methods may or may not work. When we boil our drinking water, we're not actually killing everything that's in it, but our digestive system is more than adequate to deal with whatever pathogens might be present in small numbers. However, when we're dealing with internal organs or a perfectly nutritious jar of grain for mushroom cultivation, we need to maintain a higher standard because anything that's present could cause problems down the road. I want to mention that there's a big difference between getting something sterile and keeping something sterile. I go over these concepts in a lot more detail in my video on sterile culture technique called Mycology Lab 101. I also have an upcoming video on laminar flow systems, which are sterile air filtration devices that we use to maintain sterile environment. For the moment, let's talk about some different sterilization methods and which ones will and will not work for mushroom cultivation. Sterilization methods can be grouped into a few different categories. We can use chemicals, we can use gas, we can use UV or gamma irradiation, or we can use heat. One of the most common methods that we use for sterilization, or at least for sanitation, is chemicals. We use chlorine in our drinking water. We use hand sanitizer as lubricant for masturbation, or alcohol to sanitize surfaces. One of the most important applications for sterilization is medical equipment. And when we want to sterilize something like a plastic single-use syringe or an IV bag, we can't use heat or it'll melt, and chemicals aren't adequate. So, oftentimes what's used are either gamma irradiation or some kind of UV irradiation, or a really intense poisonous gas like ethylene oxide. Ozone is another poisonous gas that's often used for sterilization. The problem with all three of these sterilization methods, gas, chemical, and radiant, is that they rely on direct contact with the thing that we're sterilizing. When we're trying to sterilize something with mass, like grain or sawdust for mushroom cultivation, chemicals won't be able to penetrate all the way through to the middle of the grain, which is the same problem with the gases. And the UV light can only touch what's on the surface. This is the reason that for mushroom cultivation, as well as most other applications of sterilization, heat is our best option. One of the great advantages of heat sterilization is that it leaves no harmful residues behind. So, after whatever we're sterilizing has cooled down, it's the perfect home for new life. There are also quite a few alternatives to sterilization that can be used for different parts of the mushroom cultivation process. Most importantly, we rely on pasteurization for certain techniques in particular, and at the end of the video, I'll be telling you about a technique called fractional pasteurization, which is also known as Tyndallization, that will allow you to prepare grain spawn and other mushroom substrates without even using a pressure cooker. I've heard of some people having success experimenting with creative alternatives to sterilization using chemicals like hydrogen peroxide or even ozone. And I'll be making a future video about a technique called cold pasteurization, where we'll use an alkaline soak to treat large quantities of mushroom substrate on the cheap. One quick side note, a lot of newcomers to mushroom cultivation have at some point thought about trying to use a microwave or a conventional oven to sterilize their mushroom substrate. I can tell you, a lot of people have tried it, a lot of people have failed. I have heard of it working in rare cases, but I just don't recommend it. All in all, the most effective and reliable method for sterilizing mushroom substrate and growth medium is to use a pressure cooker. Now you might be wondering, why not just use a cooking pot? Why do we have to use a pressure cooker? The answer lies in the relationship between temperature and pressure and the phases of water. We can never get water much hotter than about 212 degrees Fahrenheit before it undergoes a phase change and becomes steam. At that point, the steam just dissipates and takes all of that heat energy along with it. So, if we want to increase the temperature beyond the boiling point of water, we've got to trap all of that energy inside of a sealed vessel that can withstand the heat and pressure. When we talk about pressure cooking something at 15 psi, or pounds per square inch of pressure, what we're really talking about is getting that steam inside of our pressure cooker up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of the microorganisms that we need to watch out for in mushroom cultivation can be killed off at lower temperatures, and there are some that actually will survive even at 250 degrees and above. Really, we're kind of playing an odds game, but a lot of people and a lot of time have showed that these methods are generally sufficient. Another reason that we rely on steam sterilization is because steam is a lot better at penetrating and carrying the heat energy deep into our jars of grain or our big bags of sawdust. But it still takes a lot of time for all that heat to penetrate, especially when we're working with denser substrates. So we have to adjust our cook times based on what it is that we're sterilizing. However, it's also important not to overcook things, and I find that when people are starting out in mushroom cultivation, they tend to do this. We want to be absolutely sure that we've sterilized something, so we cook the crap out of it, but what we do in the process is actually caramelize sugars or burn our grain, and it becomes inedible to our mycelium. One more thing I want to touch on briefly is the vacuum issue. When a pressure cooker is full of steam, it's actually a very small amount of water that was expanded to fill all of that space. So once we turn it off, all of that's going to cool and condense back into water again. What this does is actually draw a very powerful vacuum inside of the pressure cooker. When we're working with this in a mushroom cultivation setting, this means we have two choices. We can either try to keep that pressure cooker completely sealed and then only open it and break that vacuum under laminar flow in completely sterile conditions so that it doesn't suck dirty air inside. Or we can open the pressure cooker as soon as it hits atmospheric pressure before it begins to pull a vacuum at all, unload the contents and seal them and allow them to cool. This way, we're not risking any dirty air getting sucked in and contaminating our freshly sterilized substrates. If you're new to mushroom cultivation, I know that the expense and the dangers of pressure cookers can be quite intimidating, and it's important to know that you don't need one to get started. By far, the easiest way to begin your mushroom cultivation journey, in my opinion, is to start with pre-sterilized grain, or better yet, an all-in-one grow kit. I offer these kits on my website at fungaia.life, and the most effective way to grow any kind of mushrooms from scratch, the easy way, is to use a liquid culture syringe from our trusted sponsors at truebluegenetics.org. Please use the coupon code FUNGAIA to let them know that we sent you. Once you have a few successful grows under your belt and you're ready to move on to more advanced techniques, your next best first big investment is a solid pressure cooker. There are a lot of different options out there. Cost, size, fuel source, There are a lot of different things to take into account when selecting which pressure cooker is right for you. A really popular choice for hobby mushroom cultivators is the Instant Pot. The Instant Pot offers a number of very distinct advantages. For one thing, it's completely automated. You can set it and forget it. It also has its own built-in heat source. They're small, they're relatively inexpensive, and they're useful for lots of other projects around the kitchen. The main disadvantages of Instant Pot are, 1, that they're quite small. We can only fit a couple of jars at a time. 2, they also don't actually achieve the maximum working pressure that we like to see for our mushroom substrates. We want to get up to a full 15 psi, which is about 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The Instant Pot will only go about as high as 10 psi, which means that we need to slightly increase our sterilization times. They're also hard to adequately sanitize, and so in general, people who use Instant Pots tend to have slightly higher ambient rates of contamination. The most common choice for those of us taking the dive into mushroom cultivation is a trusty Presto canner. Now, you can go and get one of these brand new from the store for about $100. As you'll see if you watch my other videos, I'm quite fond of these vintage antique Presto canners, which you can usually find for about the same price secondhand on eBay. They have a lot higher quality casting and much thicker sidewalls than the new stuff. However, make sure to get one that's listed with free returns in case you have problems when it arrives. The most common size you'll find is also a perfect one to start with, and that's usually a 21 quart, which will fit 7 1-quart mason jars. As you can see, this pressure cooker has a steam release valve, which acts as a pressure regulator that allows me to choose between 5, 10, or 15 psi. It also has a pressure gauge, which is extremely useful to help me anticipate when it's going to depressurize after it's been used. Sometimes cheaper pressure cookers don't have these features, so make sure you take a good look at what you're buying. One thing to note about the Presto canner is that it uses a rubber gasket to maintain the seal. These work great, but they do tend to wear out over time, so you'll need to replace them periodically. You can always find replacement gaskets with your pressure cooker's model number listed on them, and they'll almost always come with a replacement emergency relief valve, and it's important to replace that at the same time as you're replacing your gasket. When you're replacing your gasket, it's helpful to clean it with a little bit of soap and water, and then lubricate it using a little bit of petrol gel. I will say that after a lot of experience, this has really become my go-to pressure cooker. I use it for just about everything. That said, what's regarded as kind of the gold standard within the mushroom cultivation industry is the all-American machined aluminum pressure canner. These pressure cookers are extremely thick and heavy-duty. They use a carefully machined metal-to-metal seal with these big heavy-duty wing nuts to clamp that lid down on the top. As far as I know, these have been tested to extremely high pressures. They're very, very safe, and they can handle a lot higher working temperatures than what we would ever be using them for. If you're interested in getting into mushroom cultivation as more than a hobby, this is a good option to consider because it's designed to really take a lot more abuse than just a residential grade canner. However, I've honestly come to believe that these are a little bit more trouble than they're worth and kind of a pain in the butt when all you want to do is just cook a few jars of grain. This is the largest model that they make, which is a 41 quart canner. And honestly, I would say is a lot more work than just running 2 of these simultaneously, which gives you the same amount of space. Now, even though these don't have a gasket, they still do require maintenance. You've got to clean this off with some soap and water and re-lubricate it from time to time. The main advantage of the all-American sterilizers, in my opinion, is that you can modify them with a spring-loaded petcock and a higher temperature relief valve. This will allow you to run it at a higher operating pressure than the Prestos. You can get it up to about 25 psi, which will give you a lot more effective sterilization in a shorter period of time. The spring-loaded petcock also allows you to keep the pressure cooker under vacuum while it cools, which can be useful, as I'll describe more later on. All-American also makes an electric version of their 41 quart sterilizer that has an electric heating element and a little temperature controller that allows you to more or less automate the cycle. Obviously, this can save a lot of time and hassle. It takes a lot of work and time to prepare, load, run, and unload a pressure cooker, so it's obviously one of the major bottlenecks in mushroom cultivation. The more you can fit in a single run, or the more pressure cookers you can run at a time, the more efficient your production will be. If you want to scale up beyond the 41 quart All-American, you're going to need to look into commercial autoclaves. Now, some of these can be tens of thousands of dollars and take up an entire building. I've also seen people build them themselves out of repurposed propane tanks. Thankfully, there's also an intermediary option which has recently hit the market. And that is these 150-liter vertical steam sterilizers. I saved up for a long time for these, and I gotta say, I'm so glad I took the plunge. They're fully automated, programmable, very manageable and easy to use, especially compared to other commercial sterilization options. For the most part, they work like a charm, though obviously everything has its trade-offs. For one thing, at about $5K a piece, these aren't exactly cheap, though I did save $1 importing them directly from China. The 3-month wait for them to arrive was nothing compared to the amount of time it took me to save up so I could cough up for some big beefy copper, wire in a dedicated 100 amp sub panel, and build out a room with adequate ventilation, flow hoods, and workspace. They haven't been without their quirks, but overall, I think these are a great investment for small to mid-sized commercial operations. How to program and use these is a little bit beyond the scope of this video, but I wanted to at least introduce them and plant the seed for those of you for whom this might be a good option in the future. Now, unless you're using an Instant Pot or a sterilizer with an electric heat source, you're going to need a powerful, dedicated heat source for your pressure cooker. Many folks try to run their pressure cooker on an electric stove, and they really just don't get hot enough fast enough. Even worse, if you have a glass top electric stove, the pressure cooker will destroy it. A lot of the hot plates that are out there are actually induction burners, which means that they'll only work with steel pots, and almost all pressure cookers are made out of aluminum, so those won't work at all. The best bet for most DIYers is to use an outdoor propane stove, like the kind that are designed for running turkey fryers. These have enough power to get your pressure cooker up to pressure quickly, which means that you don't risk overcooking the contents while you're waiting for it to slowly warm up. Now, if you're really on a budget and you're desperate for an alternative, or you just want to experiment, there is a way that you can achieve similar results without a pressure cooker using just a standard soup pot. This involves heating and cooling the contents multiple times over multiple days, and it's a technique called fractional pasteurization, and I'll explain that at the end of the video. Now, that same technique can be used on a much larger scale as a cheap way to bulk up your mushroom cultivation, and it's a very useful piece of equipment to build for a lot of other reasons. I'll touch briefly on building a bulk pasteurizer in this video, but stay tuned for a more complete version later on. So by now, hopefully you've either got your pressure cooker or you know what you're going to go for. Next up, let's talk about how to use the pressure cooker, some tips for safety, and a few tricks that I really wish I'd known when I got started. Throughout the video, I'm also going to be talking a good bit about mushroom grow bags. These specialized plastic bags are pretty much the biggest thing since sliced bread in the mushroom cultivation industry. They're made of temperature-resistant polypropylene plastic, and each one sports a consistent sterile air filter. I always encourage newcomers to start with jars, but bags offer a number of great advantages. They're very easy to use and they're much more efficient than jars, so there's no wonder that they become the industry standard. However, bags can also pose the most serious risks when it comes to using sterilizers, so make sure to follow the tips in this video closely to avoid allowing the bag to balloon up inside of your pressure cooker, creating a potentially dangerous situation. Now, it should go without saying, but please, folks, be careful. Don't get burned. Don't blow yourself up. Pressure cookers, as long as they're used properly, are very safe, and there's very little reason to be nervous about using them. But the problem is when we get too comfortable, we get cavalier, we run pressure cookers and walk away, problems happen, we're not there to attend to them. So it is important to understand that we're dealing with something dangerous that could be potentially lethal if we don't use it properly. First, let's talk about how to use a standard household pressure canner. Regardless of the cooker you choose, many of these principles will work just the same. That said, each model is different, so make sure you actually read the instruction and safety manual for your particular unit. The first step is to add water. This is the most important step of all. Without water, pressure cookers simply won't work. Not only that, but they pose a fire risk, and even worse, the stress of overheating the aluminum can warp or even crack the metal. So you need to add enough that it won't boil dry before the sterilization run is complete. Consult the manual for your cooker's specifics, and when in doubt, err on the side of caution. For most 21 quarts and other medium-sized pressure cookers, it's usually about 2 quarts or liters of water. Next, you need to keep your jars or whatever you're sterilizing up above the bottom of the cooker, and if possible, it's best to keep the jars out of the water completely. This is especially important when cooking liquids like agar media or liquid culture, as the heat differential can crack and break the jars. Most cookers come with a rack for this purpose, but it's usually thin. A simple solution to this problem is to use some stainless steel carriage bolts to hold the rack up a bit higher, which makes plenty of space for water below.
Now it's time for step 2. Load your pressure cooker. I know you want to cram it as full as you can, but be careful. Leave space for things to expand. This is especially important if you're using mushroom grow bags. Overloading can prevent adequate steam penetration, and worse, it can cause the contents to block the steam relief valves, which creates a very dangerous situation. I've found that expanded mesh pizza racks are the perfect tool for creating space between bags for steam to pass. They come in a variety of sizes and they're made of aluminum so they won't rust. When sterilizing jars, and especially liquids, I also always cover everything in aluminum foil. It isn't strictly necessary, but 1, it protects the jars from drips and moisture saturating the jar filters. 2, it adds a layer of protection to help maintain sterility when handling the jars after they've been cooked. And 3, it also helps contain the mess if a jar boils over while it's cooking. If I'm sterilizing laboratory implements, extra jar lids, reusable petri dishes, or anything else like that, I also always make sure to wrap these in foil for good measure.
Here's another important tip. When you're loading bags or jars into a pressure cooker, you never want to seal them beforehand. As the contents heat up, the air inside expands, and if that air has nowhere to go, it can actually build up an enormous amount of pressure inside of that sealed vessel. If we're just using a regular mason jar, this will usually just blow the lid right off. But I've even seen heavy-duty borosilicate lab flasks explode under the intense pressure inside of a sterilizer. This is an even more serious concern if you're using bags, because if the bag is sealed, it can inflate like a balloon. And the plastic is very flexible when it's hot, and so it'll stretch, and it can even seal the safety relief valves of your pressure cooker. If an unattentive operator doesn't notice what's happening and continues heating the pressure cooker because they don't see that pressure registering on the gauge, this can create a very dangerous situation and even potentially a deadly one. This is the only occasion where I've heard of serious catastrophic pressure cooker failures in the mushroom cultivation industry, so it's very worth being aware of. As an added precaution, whenever I'm working with bags, I always place an extra rack on top so that even if those bags do balloon up, it'll at least prevent them from blocking that steam escape valve. Sometimes folks will assume that just because their jars or bags have an air filter on it, it's vented, the air can escape, so it's safe to seal it before putting it in the pressure cooker. The thing is, these filters are very, very fine and they don't allow enough air to pass quickly enough to prevent the issue with ballooning or exploding jars that I just described. Now, in some cases, if you're using, say, a mushroom fruiting bag that's got a much coarser, larger filter, it might be okay, but honestly, I think it's just not worth the risk. What we want to do instead is put everything into the pressure cooker unsealed and then seal it as soon as that cycle is complete. Obviously, this means that we'll need to take some extra precautions at the end of our pressure cooker cycle, but don't worry, I'll get to that in just a moment.
Step 3. Now it's time to run the pressure cooker. No matter what kind of cooker you're using, you'll want to let it vent as it heats. Remember, our target temperature-pressure relationship only applies with pure steam, so we've got to let the air escape first. Leave the shaker weight off of the regulator, or leave the valve open. Wait until it begins releasing a steady jet of steam, and allow it to vent for a few minutes before adding the weight or closing the valve. Keep a close eye on it while it builds pressure, so you can turn it down once the weight starts to rattle or the pressure gauge reaches 15 psi. You'll want to ride the dial a bit to get the right level of heat. As the contents absorb the heat, you can turn the cooker down to a lower and lower setting. However, this usually takes a little practice, so plan on babysitting it closely for the first few runs to make sure it doesn't run away on you. With a standard shaker weight steam regulator, the goal is to hold the cooker at a temperature where the weight rattles intermittently, about once every minute or so. If using a sealed petcock setup, you'll need to control the temperature more carefully. Start the timer for your cook time as soon as the pressure cooker reaches full working pressure. Cook times will vary based on how much mass you're sterilizing, your altitude, and the power of your heat source, so it may take a little trial and error to get it dialed in. Undercooking will result in inadequate sterilization, but overcooking will make the substrate inedible to the fungus. To start with, here are some good benchmarks. All of these cook times are based on 15 psi standard working pressure. Liquids convect and transfer heat more efficiently than solids, which means that the sugars in the liquid also caramelize faster. So, usually 35 to 45 minutes is plenty. Grain leaves lots of room for steam to surround and penetrate it, and it has a relatively low density. So a cook time of 90 minutes is quite standard for jars of grain, and I recommend adding about 15 minutes if you're using bags. I also recommend keeping your bag size to no more than about 3 or 4 pounds of grain. Obviously, we want to cram as much in there for efficiency's sake, but it's not going to do us much good if the whole bag contaminates. Denser substrates like sawdust need longer, but they can also tolerate more heat. I'd say start at about 2 to 2.5 hours for a 4 or 5 pound block of sawdust spawn. Again, all of these cook times are based on a 15 psi working pressure, which reaches approximately 250 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll need to increase these times slightly if using an instant pot, which I'll cover shortly, and you'll need to decrease them if you're using a commercial autoclave at a higher sterilization temperature. Step 4, it's time for cool down. Once the time's up, shut off your heat source and allow your pressure cooker to cool naturally. I know, you want the mushrooms to grow right now. But rushing this part of the process is, in my experience, always a bad idea. If you vent the cooker even just a few minutes before total depressurization, it will cause liquids to boil over, grains to burst, and bags to balloon to the point of popping, ruining the whole run and all that hard work. Better to just wait. On the other hand, if you wait too long, all that steam will condense back into water, and this means it will be pulling in outside air with all its spores into your precious, freshly sterilized spore food. If you have a spring-loaded petcock setup, you can just leave the cooker sealed and let it cool completely under vacuum, which can be preferable in certain situations, which I'll explain shortly when discussing the All-American sterilizer. But for the most part, you'll want to catch it just in time as it reaches atmospheric pressure. Depending on the size of the load, cool down can take quite a while. If you have a pressure gauge, you can just keep an eye on it. If not, there's almost always some little nipply thing poking up that you can press to give you some sense of the pressure remaining. Step 5. Safely unloading your pressure cooker. Now that your jars or bags have been sterilized, you'll want to take extra care to keep them that way. The most reliably sterile way to unload a pressure cooker is in front of a laminar flow hood. Always wait until the pressure cooker is almost fully depressurized to just 2 or 3 psi before attempting to move it, and take care not to burn yourself. I welded legs and wheels to my propane burner so I can just wheel the whole thing in front of the flow hood. This is especially helpful when running big, heavy cookers. Wait until the pressure cooker fully depressurizes and the little nipply thing falls. Then, just to be extra certain, open the relief valve before removing the lid and unloading the contents. Take the jars or bags out carefully, one at a time. Remember, these are likely still hotter than the boiling point of water. Now, I've worked for years in kitchens and cafes, so I'm quite comfortable handling hot things, and I don't like big, clumsy gloves. But for most folks, some thoroughly sanitized canning tongs or heat-resistant gloves are a really good idea here. It's important to mention here that you should never try to sanitize the hot cooker with alcohol. The evaporative cooling effect of the alcohol can cause heat shock and stress fracture the cooker. Now, you can tighten the lids on your jars and seal your bags as they cool. Or just leave them in front of the flow hood until they're cool enough to inoculate. Now you can remove the emptied cooker from your workspace and let it continue to cool. On the other hand, if you're not using a laminar flow hood, you'll be relying on the jar or the bag filters to protect the contents as they cool. In this case, you'll also want to just wait until the cooker can be safely opened, then carefully reach in and either tighten the lids on the jars or seal the bags while they're still hot. At this stage, the heat they're putting off will prevent any contaminants from finding purchase. A couple more tips about bags. If you don't have a heat sealer, you can use a zip tie or a twist tie to seal them. If you seal them while they're still hot, they'll come out somewhat vacuum sealed. This will make it difficult to mix them after inoculation. So, I like to let the bags cool for a while under laminar flow, then lift the corners and slowly draw a bit of sterile air into them before sealing them. This makes mixing a million times easier after inoculation, which in turn leads to faster growth and better results overall. If you don't have a flow hood, one way you can achieve the same effect is to hang the bags from their tops, which will allow air to be slowly drawn in through that sterile filter. Once your jars or bags have cooled completely, they're ready for inoculation. The easiest way to do this is to use a liquid culture syringe. I've got a whole video about this, and while you're checking that out, make sure to also go visit our shop at fungaia.life for a curated selection of gourmet and medicinal mushroom varieties by donation. And of course, don't forget to visit our trusted partners and the sponsor of today's video at truebluegenetics.org for a huge selection of liquid culture at great prices and totally unmatched quality. As always, please use the coupon code FUNGAIA at checkout to show us some love and get yourself 20% off.
One last tip. As you're working on getting your sterilization process dialed in, it's a good idea to just leave one bag or jar uninoculated. If it sits there for a while and nothing grows, then you'll know you succeeded. Properly sterilized grain and substrate with good air filtration can remain completely viable for a very long time, as long as it doesn't dry out. So another good approach is just to prep a lot, let it sit out for a few days, make sure it doesn't contaminate, and then you can go ahead and inoculate it with confidence. Next up, I'll talk about special considerations for specific types of pressure cookers, beginning with the Instant Pot. I'll be honest, I actually only recently got an Instant Pot specifically for making this video, but I'm so glad I did. In the long term, you're definitely going to want something bigger, but as a first investment, I think this is actually a pretty good option. It's compact, it's fully automated, which is a huge plus, and it's especially good for sterilizing agar media and making liquid culture. It's also super useful for plenty of other projects around the kitchen, which is a pretty good selling point if you've got roommates who are maybe starting to raise some eyebrows about tubs, jars, and the footprint of your new hobby. I've started using mine almost every day for cooking rice, making bone broth, yogurt. It's also very good for pasteurizing small amounts of mushroom substrate, which I'll explain more in my upcoming video on that topic. As I've said, one of the main disadvantages of Instant Pot is its size. You can only fit a handful of jars. I did some experimenting and I found that actually the best ones to use are these regular mouth pint jars because you can actually fit 5 of them. Yeah, you might have to wiggle them around a little bit. You can also fit 4 of the wide mouth pint jars, but unfortunately you're not going to be able to fit a full 1-quart mason jar. They're just too tall. Just like with other pressure cookers, to use an Instant Pot for mushroom cultivation, you're going to need to find a rack that will keep your jars off the bottom of the Instant Pot, and you're going to have to add water and do everything exactly as you would with a larger setup.
Cover all of the jars with foil, close the lid, and set the cook time. Different models have different features, so check out the manual if yours doesn't match up to mine. Press pressure cook, then press it again to set it to the highest setting.
The other main disadvantage of an Instant Pot is that it doesn't actually achieve the full working pressure that we want for meeting commercial sterilization standards. But for the hobby grower, it's usually good enough. Whereas with a typical setup, we'll be getting it to at least 15, maybe even 20 psi. The highest we can go with Instant Pot is usually about 10 to 12 psi. So we're going to need to adjust our cook times accordingly. Now you can calculate this exactly using some fancy math or maybe some conversion tables, but I think it's good enough to just go with a rough estimate of about 150% increase in your cook time. This means if you're cooking liquids like agar media or liquid culture, you're going to want to bump it up to about an hour. If you're working with grain, 2 hours should be sufficient. And if you're working with denser substrates, you'll want to go for maybe 3 or more.
Set your cook time using the plus-minus buttons. And note, the timer won't start until it achieves full pressure, which is what you want. Also, it will automatically activate the keep warm function, which will prevent the cooker from cooling normally when it's done. So, press that again to make sure that the light's off. Then, just wait for the beep and you're off to the races. Just like any other pressure cooker, we want to allow the air to vent as it heats up to pressure. Leave the relief valve in the venting position until it's releasing a steady jet of steam before switching it to the sealing position to begin building pressure. Also, like other cookers, Instant Pot has a safety relief valve that will pop up when it's pressurized. You can poke it to see where things are at while it cooks. Once it's fully depressurized, you can remove the lid and then either seal the contents or unload them under laminar flow like I just described. Let's talk about the all-American brand of sterilizers. These work just like cheaper cookers with a few important differences. The biggest difference is the metal-to-metal seal. For it to work properly, the metal contact surfaces need to be clean and free of debris. They should also be lightly lubricated using a high-quality petroleum lubricant. To seal the lid, first adjust it so that it sits with even spacing all the way around the rim. Swing all of the wing nuts into position and twist them just until they make contact, but don't tighten them yet. Inspect the spacing again and adjust it if necessary. Then, Tighten 2 of the wing nuts opposite each other simultaneously with equal pressure. Get them snug but not fully tightened. Then do the same thing and snug up the next pair perpendicular to the first one. Repeat this torquing process with all of the wing nuts. Inspect the lid spacing one last time, and then run through them all to give them one last twist. You don't need to wrench down on the wing nuts, and over-tightening can stress the metal and make the lid very difficult to remove when it's hot. Torquing the wing nuts in this way is an important step to make sure that you get a full seal and an even tension on the lid. If steam is escaping from the sides, this indicates a problem, and you should shut off the heat, wait for it to depressurize, open, inspect, and then repeat the whole process. As I mentioned in the introduction, one of the main advantages of these pressure cookers is that you can modify them to operate at higher pressure and to hold a vacuum on cool down by replacing the shaker weight with a spring-loaded petcock. If you do this, you'll also need to swap the stock black rubber safety relief valve with a red one that's rated for higher pressure. Check out the description for a link to find these mod parts. Careful not to over-tighten the petcock when you replace it. It doesn't need as much torque as you might think it does. You can lift the lever to open and close the valve for manually venting. Otherwise, it will only vent at about 26 psi, which is crazy hot, so you'll have to control the heat manually to avoid getting it that high if at all possible. Some folks prefer the shaker weight for this reason. Other than that, this works the same as any other setup. Leave the valve open to vent air during the beginning, close it to build pressure and to run the pressure cooker, and then wait for the whole thing to fully depressurize before loosening the wing nuts and trying to remove the lid. Aside from higher working pressure, the main attraction of these valves is that 1, they don't release steam during normal operation, which can otherwise cause ballooning when using bags, and 2, they will hold a vacuum on cool down. This means that you can turn off your pressure cooker at the end of the sterilization cycle and walk away for the night. The contents will cool under vacuum, and when you come back the next day, you can thoroughly sanitize the outside of the cool pressure cooker and unload it under laminar flow. Then, the contents can be inoculated and sealed right away, making this a very efficient workflow for small commercial mushroom farming operations. It's worth noting, however, that grains can tend to pop when left under vacuum overnight. So, this technique really works best when sterilizing sawdust blocks for inoculation with already prepared grain spawn.
Now for the part of the video I know a lot of you have been waiting for, and that is how to prepare your grain spawn for mushroom cultivation without using a pressure cooker at all. Now, it's important to say that nothing can quite top the consistent results that you can achieve with steam sterilization when it comes to preparing growth media, grain, and other mushroom substrates for mushroom cultivation. But if you're tight on funds, or you don't have access to a pressure cooker, or you don't want to deal with the risks involved with using one, or maybe if you're just interested in low-tech, outdoor, DIY mushroom cultivation techniques, then this is an incredibly useful method to have in your toolbox, and it's worked well for a lot of mushroom growers. The technique that I'm going to show you is a form of fractional pasteurization called Tyndallization, which really just involves heating your grain or your mushroom substrate multiple times over multiple days. Tyndallization is not 100% effective, but it does work surprisingly well, especially for grain spawn. Unlike sterilizing in a pressure cooker, this does take multiple days, so you're going to need to plan ahead. That said, it takes really only about the same amount of overall time and energy as running a pressure cooker, and whereas a pressure cooker you need to attend for several consecutive hours, this only requires you to pay attention for a couple hours a day. But the best part is, all you'll need for this technique is a standard cooking pot with a lid and a stove to heat it on. You can even use this exact same method on a much larger scale using, for example, a steel drum, which I'll show you at the end of the video. Now, the other thing that you'll need, of course, is your prepared grain spawn in your mushroom culture jars. So, if you're new to that, make sure to check out my video on how to prepare grain spawn, how to make injection port filtered lids for mushroom cultivation, and lots more detailed videos that will describe other important parts of the process. Now, before we just dive right into the method, let's let Professor Sporadicus explain a little bit more about the science. Now, most of the organisms that we're trying to avoid in mushroom cultivation, like bacteria, yeast, mold, can't survive much above the boiling point of water. However, there are some that can. Some fungal spores are heat resistant, for example, and many bacteria produce heat-tolerant endospores. Steam sterilization, on one hand, aims to get our growth material hot enough for long enough that it absolutely destroys all biological cells. Pasteurization, on the other hand, aims at reducing microbial populations without necessarily eliminating them altogether. The point of Tyndallization is to pasteurize multiple times in a row, allowing time for the material to cool and for anything that might be living in it to incubate in between. During this time, anything that might have survived that first round of pasteurization, like those bacterial endospores or some mold spores, will actually be heat activated and then they'll germinate and grow, at which time they're far more susceptible to the subsequent heat of the next round of pasteurization. Usually just 2 rounds of this is sufficient, but we'll usually do a third just for good measure.
Just like with a pressure cooker, you'll want to keep your jars up off the bottom of the cooker. As I've described elsewhere, you can easily make a rack using a metal trivet and some 1.5-inch stainless steel carriage bolts. The rack should leave plenty of space to add about 2 quarts of water to the pot. Prepare your grain jars and load your pot just like you would with a pressure cooker. First, cover everything with a tinfoil hat. Make sure to leave plenty of space for steam to pass. Unlike a pressure cooker, there's no pressure here, so you can seal the jars beforehand, though leaving them vented will allow heat to enter more effectively. Different setups, load sizes, and altitudes will behave differently, so it's a good idea to calibrate your process. If you have a thermometer with a probe, place it into a jar of water in the center of the pot. This will give you insight into your times and temperatures. There aren't any hard and fast rules here, so use your intuition, experiment, and have fun. Place the pot over high heat until it comes to a full boil, then turn it down to a steady simmer. For the first run, I usually start with a gentle pasteurization, aiming for a minimum internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit. 1 or 2 hours is usually sufficient for this. Then turn off the heat and allow the pot to cool. Remember, the idea here is to give things time to awaken and grow, so you'll want to wait at least 24 hours before running it again. You can even let it go a full 2 days if you're feeling fermenty. For the second run, you'll want to get the minimum internal temp as high as possible. Running the heat for 2 or more hours will usually get it up to at least 190 degrees Fahrenheit and hold it there for a good while. Then, give it another 24 hours. By now, most everything should be pretty cooked, so we're just trying to catch the stragglers and those tricksters who hung behind. For the final run, cook it just like the second, waiting for the jars to warm up to full temp and then holding them there for a while. By now, they're about as good as they're going to get, so all that's left to do is let them cool, inoculate with your True Blue Genetics liquid culture syringe, and watch the mycelium proliferate.
While this technique is more prone to contamination than conventional sterilization methods, it does cook the grain more gently and it allows for more enzymatic pre-digestion. I know some folks who use both techniques but actually prefer Tyndallization for grain spawn specifically because they believe that it's more loving and easy for the mycelium to eat, leading to faster growth rates and purportedly better ultimate results. Now, as you might imagine, you can use this exact same method on any scale. All you really need is just a larger pot. This is called a bulk pasteurizer, and it's essentially like a giant vegetable steamer. As you can see, I made this one out of a second-hand 55-gallon steel drum. If you poke around, you can usually find one of these on the cheap as they're basically an industrial waste product. Just make sure that you find one that comes with a pretty tight-fitting lid. It doesn't have to be totally sealed, but you want it to at least stay on there pretty snugly. I added a hot water spigot, which I got from my local brewing supply, and installed just using a 1-inch hole saw. And the most important modification is a rack that will help keep the contents up off the bottom so the water can rest underneath. This is just the rack from a briquette barbecue grill that just so happens to fit perfectly inside here. This one I've modified with some 4-inch stainless steel carriage bolts and some nice oversized fender washers. Now, this was one of the first pieces of equipment I built when I started Fungaia, and my primary business was producing oyster mushrooms and other gourmets for sale at the farmers market and local restaurants. So I was primarily using this to pasteurize bulk wheat straw. That's why I used some aluminum window screen so the straw wouldn't just fall through into the water. And I sewed that into place using some stainless steel welder wire. I found in the long run though that actually this part's not necessary. The last thing that you'll need is a dedicated heat source. Now, the most rustic way to do this is to just set the whole thing on some cinder blocks or some bricks and build a fire underneath. But obviously a lot more convenient and efficient is going to be a classic propane burner. If you live in the US, you're going to find these marketed as turkey fryers. And in this case, I was able to save $1 by welding a little cart for it myself and just buying the burner piece. There's a link for that in the description. But you could find these at most hardware stores, and they're used specifically for boiling big pots of oil to fry turkeys in. I want to say here that this is a great project specifically for those of you who are strapped for cash, especially for all my beloved bushcraft myco warriors out there living in remote areas where access to more specialized equipment is very limited. You can make this even simpler and cheaper. You don't even need to put the valve in the bottom. You can either siphon the water out, or if you're only using small amounts just to pasteurize bottles and jars, you can tip the whole thing over and pour it out. Instead of finding a metal rack, you can just use a wooden one, or even just stack some sticks at the bottom to keep stuff up out of the water. Now, instead of using canning jars and specialized mushroom lids, I've also seen people make grain spawn just by packing it into old beer bottles and stuffing some polyfill in the neck. And if you're gonna use this to cook straw, wood chips, or just bulk woody matter, you could just use it as is. If you're gonna be using jars or bottles, as I described, you can just stack them in there, pile them in, because there's always gonna be space around them for the steam to circulate. If you're gonna be using bags, which is the most efficient way to pasteurize bulk substrate, for example, you wanna make sure to create plenty of space around them for the steam to pass. I've found that these expanded mesh aluminum pizza screens are a really great option for creating some space in between the layers of bags. I'll be talking more about the bulk pasteurizer and cold pasteurization methods and other bushcraft mycology techniques in future videos, but hopefully this can plant the seed. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in, folks. I hope this video has been helpful for you, and I'm so grateful to get to be a part of your mushroom cultivation journey. My name's Paul Lynn, and if you can't tell already, I'm a bit of a feral critter. I would describe myself as an ecocentric eccentric, and I love this precious earth. I embrace the irony of teaching about sterilization and sterile culture methods when the heart of my work is to help foster more abundant life. I believe that fungi have an incredible amount to teach us about our shared world, and that mushroom cultivation is a portal to uncharted realms at the intersection of science, service, and ceremony. That's why I'm inviting you to learn and share here alongside me as I work towards my life dream of a free school. So don't forget to check out my other videos, including information on how to prepare your own grain spawn, liquid culture, a whole crash course on laboratory skills, and, of course, subscribe and turn on channel notifications so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming videos we're currently working on about substrate, flow hoods, how liquid fermentation of terrestrial fungi will change the world. And when you're ready to take the plunge, make sure to get yourself off to a great start by using some incredible fungal genetics from our good friends and trusted partners at truebluegenetics.org. I can attest that they are deeply committed to their craft and offer a great selection of some of the best, healthiest, most vigorous liquid culture on the market at great prices, especially when you use the coupon code FUNGAIA to get 20% off at checkout and let them know that we sent you. I really appreciate the support. It means a lot to me, and it goes a long way to helping me continue to create free educational videos like this one. I'm so grateful to share the journey with you. Thanks for being here, and until next time, much love, keep on mucking.